Thank you for coming to our glorious National Museum of the American Indian and for being here for the Symposium on Racist Stereotypes and Cultural Appropriation in American Sports. A serious topic. I'm Suzanne Schoen Harjo, and I'm president of the Morningstar Institute. I'm Cheyenne and Hodelgi Muskogee. I'm a founder of this museum, a past executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, a columnist for Indian Country Today, Media Network, and a mother and a grandmother. And I'm delighted to be moderating this distinguished panel. The people here have, some of them come a long way and barely made it. Some of them have come a short way and need to get out of here tomorrow morning before it starts snowing in their country. So I'm grateful for everyone who's traveled far and who are nearby and who've joined us to make this symposium a success. Did everyone see the panel this morning? Wasn't that wonderful? Give them applause. And I hope you'll be able to stay for the community conversation later. We're going to begin, as is the custom for some of us, to begin with our elders and end with our elders. We begin with someone who could not join us when Frankenstorm Sandy caused the postponement of this from the original date of November 1st, and we rescheduled. We lost one of our panelists, Oren Lyons, an Onondaga chief and faith keeper, Haudenosaunee, from Syracuse University, and he is here through the marvel of technology. Syracuse University was able to interview him and sent us the DVD of it. So if that is queued up, let's get ready to show Chief Lyons. And he was one of the main people who got Syracuse University to drop the Saltine Warrior, and well, they should have. And he was in a good position to do that. He was a lacrosse star at Syracuse and an All-American with Jim Brown, for sports fans here. And he will not say that. He's very modest and does not say that on the clip you're seeing, but he says something about, I played a little lacrosse, I think. And but he's a big deal. And he started the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team, which I think is ranked number 3 in the world now. And I think in their last tournament beat Team USA. So they're playing other countries and doing really, really well. And those are all Iroquois, all Haudenosaunee people. So if we're ready to show the clip of Oren Lyons, let's do that now.
Implacable Indian, you know, the fierce warrior. Really, it's something that I think is a white man's image. It's much like I hear, you know, Indian war whoop. They call it a war whoop. And everybody's heard it, and it's always whoo, 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 whoo. And every time I hear that, I know it's a white man, because I've only ever, in my whole life, ever heard a white man do it. I've never heard an Indian do that. So every time you hear it, I say, oh, there's an Indian, this white guy's howling again. In actuality, what I think is important and which has a progression in American sports is the fact that if you look at all of the new expansion leagues, whether it's hockey, whether it's basketball or baseball or anything, Every major sport has not put out a depiction of an Indian. They're all new. It's the Coyotes, well, it's everything but an Indian, and I think that's very important to comprehend, because it means that the sport itself has comprehended that and has deliberately avoided that. And I think the American public and young people should take a lesson from that, because they revere their sports and their sports people, and that's a very strong lesson right there. So we know that also that the Washington Redskins are in a court battle and have lost the first round, and it's now up for the second round. That yes, it is a racist and demeaning depiction. The idea of red skin, and redskins probably one of the most demeaning of the terms in the history of America. And yet there they are. And interestingly enough, if you're watchful and you go to some of the Washington Redskin football games and look up into their box that they have, obviously, then you will find senators and congressmen sitting in there in this box and in effect promoting that whole idea. So it cuts right to the core. It cuts right to the basic structure of and the ethical structure of the United States itself. And they're going to lose. They're losing now, and they're going to lose eventually. So I think it's time for America to move on. I know that in most cases in the schools, in the history books, there's very little about American Indians. Usually we're in the way of progress. We're the other all the time. You know, we're the ones that tear up the train tracks. You know, we're the ones that cut down, you know, the telephone lines. We're the ones that get in the way of the great expansion west. That whole idea. It's in the history books, and so no wonder that young people have no understanding. There has to be an education in that direction as to the true history of this country. And until it's a standard in American history books, how do you expect the children to understand that? So I think on an ethical basis, you have a strong group of people in Ontario where they're just having this problem. You had a very courageous school board decide that they were going to drop that depiction of a mascot, and rightly so. The reaction they got was coming from ignorance, and that's what we have to really deal with. We have to deal with the ignorance of the American people concerning Native peoples and the true history of this country. And the fact is that we are in serious times now, and we're going to need one another's help to survive, and now's not the time to be fighting each other. Now's the time to be moving on. So I think that the opportunity is really there, and it will happen. It'll take time, but it will happen. And we, the Native people who are depicted as these fierce warriors, we'll have to stand our ground, and we'll have to hold our position, and in time it will prevail, and we'll be vindicated, and America will have grown up one more notch.
Well, I'm glad he could be here a little bit. Our last speaker is going to be the Honorable Ben Nighthorse Campbell, my Cheyenne brother, who is on the Council of Chiefs of the Northern Cheyenne Tribe. He's president of Nighthorse Consultants. He's a trustee of the National Museum of the American Indian, an award-winning artist and jeweler. And, oh, by the way, he was a representative of Colorado in the U.S. House of Representatives from 87 to 93, and a U.S. Senator of Colorado, 92 to 2005. Our next to the last speaker will be Delise Omili, Esquire, who is Director of Governance and International Affairs, National Collegiate Athletic Association. Oh, that's what it stands for, the NCAA. Before her will be N. Bruce Duthu, Esquire, who is HUMA, and Chair and Professor, Native American Studies, Dartmouth College. Ms. Lois Risling, an educator, land specialist for the Hoopa Valley Tribes, a retired director of the Center for Indian Community Development at Humboldt State University. She's a medicine woman and has worked with other young women to revive the Hoopa flower dance, which was outlawed for so long by the United States civilization regulations, which outlawed all Native ceremonies. Dr. Lee Hester, who is our first presenter, who is an associate professor and director of American Indian Studies and director of the Meredith Indigenous Humanities Center, the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma, and he is all Oklahoma, everything Oklahoma. He got all of his degrees, including his doctorate at the University of Oklahoma, and just missed the part of the OU experience where they had the dancing idiot, as he used to be called, Little Red, the mascot, who was the very first so-called native mascot in the United States to fall. And before he presents, I want to say something. Here's the good news, that we collectively have eliminated over 2/3 of these so-called native references in sports. There were little over 3,000 when Little Red was dancing, and now there are just over 900. So that's a sea change societally in America, and we are part of the maturation of America. Every time one of these goes away, you can know that there were hundreds and hundreds of people, mostly Native people, but not exclusively Native people, who were the ones in the trenches trying to get rid of a mascot or a name or a logo or a behavior. Could be as simple as the chop. And Dr. Hester is here as evidence and to attest to the fact that the University of Oklahoma has a long way to go as well. Dr. Hester?
Well, thank you very much. Halito, Chimichukma, Saho Chifowet, Lee Hester, Chatasia Hoke, which is to say hello, how are you? My name is Lee Hester. I am a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I usually begin my talks with a little bit of the Choctaw language because in a lot of cases it's the first time that anyone will have ever heard a native language. But the great thing is that here at the National Museum of the American Indian, I know that native languages have been spoken many times and really have a home away from home here. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very humbled to be a member of this fine panel and to speak in this setting. I'd like to thank my hosts for their kindness in asking me. I was a student at the University of Oklahoma for 20 years before they got rid of me. I started at OU in the same decade that OU's mascot, Little Red, was banned, as Suzanne's already told you, so I know about that from my own youth. Since then, I've written about the mascot issue, and specifically about mascots at the University of Oklahoma and at Oklahoma City University. Additionally, I've had access to the research materials that were collected by Jeff Kettle and Chelsea Masters specifically for this conference, and I really wanted to thank them. Up there you'll see a picture of Little Red as Little Red was. At different times, Little Red was portrayed from the 1930s on to 1970 by various individuals. Some portrayals more stereotypical than others, but always dancing to a very, very stereotypical tom-tom beat provided by the university band. Though activists like Clyde Warrior spoke out against these demeaning and stereotypical portrayals as early as the early 1960s, the banning of Little Red at OU was really part of a larger social mobilization that Vine Deloria called the Red Power movement. A key part of that movement was the National Indian Youth Council, created in 1961 by a group of young Indian leaders who felt that the National Congress of the American Indian was too conservative. In 1969, Gerald Wilkerson and Bill and Steve Ponsono were among those seeking to establish a chapter of the National Indian Youth Council at OU. They saw Little Red as an issue that was both important in itself and also useful in grabbing headlines to help establish that chapter at OU. In 1969, the newly established chapter submitted a petition to halt the use of Little Red. By February 1970, a university committee had recommended that the use be stopped, and OU's president at the time rapidly did so within 2 months. The issue polarized the American Indian community. Large numbers adamantly supported Little Red, making the university's abrupt abandonment something of a mystery. Why were so many American Indian people so strongly on both sides of the Little Red controversy, and why did the university so readily accede to the ban? Well, the answer to these questions really lies in OU's identity. Okay, that's the seal of the University of Oklahoma. As you can see, it's a farmer and sowing the metaphorical seeds of knowledge. And of course, the farmer there is reminiscent of the many settlers who came to Oklahoma for land. The other major symbol of OU is the Sooner Schooner. And there that is. It's a representation of the prairie schooner that carried settlers to Oklahoma. Those are the same schooners used in the land runs to claim Indian land taken by the federal government in defiance of treaties guaranteeing that land to American Indian people forever. OU's fight song, Boomer Sooner, is just a constant repetition of those two words. Boomer, referring to those people who would wait until the boom of a cannon used by the government to signal that it was okay to stake their claim on Indian land, and Sooner, referring to the settlers who jumped the gun. From an Indian perspective, both the boomers and the Sooners were stealing Indian land. OU's identity as a colonizing settler institution is clear. And that identity explains the reactions of the Native American community on both sides of the issue, as well as the actions of the university in rapidly abandoning Little Red. For Native supporters of Little Red, the mascot was the only tangible symbol of the presence and contributions of American Indians at OU. To protesters, Little Red was a cruel irony, underscoring OU's colonizing identity. To university administrators, Little Red was largely a non sequitur with no real connection to the university, easily abandoned when it became a source of controversy, leaving the University of Oklahoma to go about business as it always had. The banning of Little Red delighted protesters and infuriated supporters, but it didn't do anything to change the problematic relationship of OU to the Indian community. Without Little Red as a focal point, the Indian protests withered. Though protesters did have a few other victories, they got an American Indian student coordinator, a student lounge, and some Native Studies courses started. But by the time I arrived at OU, the lounge was in disrepair, and the courses were seldom offered. Like most students, I focused on my own future and didn't notice the institutional problems, thinking they'd been solved by the previous generation of Indian students. I'd been at OU for about 9 years before I began to experience my own problems there. My proposed dissertation topic on Native philosophy was not allowed. And when I switched to federal Indian law, the graduate college blocked my study of the Choctaw language. I was initially bewildered, then angry, but my committee allowed me to go ahead and study the Choctaw language informally, so we kind of got around the graduate college in that way. I went ahead and let the matter drop because it was easier to do so, and I just moved forward. But all around the university, other Indian students were facing the same kind of problems. Student resentment boiled over in March of 1994 when members of the Phi Kappa Psi fraternity got drunk, stripped naked, and danced, whooping and hollering around a teepee that had been set up for Native American Heritage Week. This desecration infuriated Indian students, but the university's actions made it far worse and shifted the focus of our anger from the fraternity to the university. From our perspective, the university had acted to protect the fraternity and its members, never revealing the names of the perpetrators, never sanctioning the fraternity. American Indian students and faculty came together in another wave of activism, with representatives of every American Indian student organization on campus meeting weekly in what became known as the American Indian Roundtable. Though we identified a number of major areas of concern, we all agreed that the biggest problem was really the institutional culture of the university. The solution we sought was a very traditional one, what the Iroquois call polishing the covenant chain. We wanted a real relationship between the University of Oklahoma and Indian people through regularly scheduled meetings with Indian students, faculty, staff, and administrators of the university. The problem is that the university never really understood. I suspect that some of the folks in the university administration thought we were seeking shared governance, which we weren't. I think that a lot of them thought that it was just a huge waste of time. Protests heightened, including a 2-month fast by one of our students, and resolutions of condemnation by some tribal governments. Eventually, the university made some substantive improvements, including the funding and staffing of a Native American Studies program, which has to some extent helped to provide an American Indian voice on campus. The university's actions decreased tensions, and like most student protests, this one kind of slowly ground to a halt as students graduated. For my part, I spent about 2 years of my life taken up in those protests. And even though it did some real good, the University of Oklahoma's teams are still really rightly known as the Sooners. Thank you.
Is Professor Victoria Phillips in the audience? And yes, and could you stand, give a round of applause to Professor Phillips and her students. And I'll tell you why. They've created the beginnings of a really good archive for the National Museum of the American Indian on this subject. And she and her students did a tremendous amount of research in a very short period of time on these 4 big universities that were among the very first to rid themselves of their racist stereotypes. The University of Oklahoma, Stanford, Dartmouth, and Syracuse University. And they really did extraordinary work, and I'm so happy that they did that and that some of them are here, and thank you for doing that. We'll be careful to say American University because AU sounds an awful lot like OU. So, but we really are indebted to you and to your law clinic for doing this extraordinary research. And we now have an archive to build on. Our next presenter was at Stanford at the same time that the mascot was there, and the mascot was a fellow tribal member. So as Lee passes the baton there,
I don't know. I wrote here on the information highways.
okay. Maybe I could help her.
Hey, Young, Ayakwi, greetings. I want to thank all of you for coming to this forum, and I want to thank the museum for having this forum, and thank Suzanne for thinking about me and inviting me to present. Before I begin to address my experience at Stanford when the mascot was then removed, I want to give you a little background on Stanford and the Indian mascot so that I don't know if everybody is familiar with how they got to be the Stanford Indians. But Stanford was officially known as the Indians from 1930 to 1972. Stanford didn't have an official nickname until the Indians was adopted in 1930, and there were a number of factors that came together, one of them being that Pop Warner came there to be a coach, and he had had this long legacy at working at Carlisle Indian School. They adopted the Indian as their mascot in November 25th, 1930, and they said that the Indian was recognized as the symbol of Stanford and captured its spirit, and that the Indian was the symbol of Stanford. So in January 1931, the Stanford Illustrated Review published an article by two Stanford graduates that expressed what they give as the reasons for why this having the Indian at Stanford was so important and what gave the justification for having that. I'm going to read you excerpts of it. It's kind of long, but I think it captures really what the Stanford mascot is about.
And the photo is up there.
Oh, this is the Stanford mascot. At last, the Stanford Indians are real Indians. The red man has stepped forth to claim his rightful heritage. The Scalpers, a society composed of Stanford Indians, escorted the drum with great pomp and ceremony to the cheerleader stand, and from the booming of the drum emerged the Indian chant. It went like this: Stanford Indians, scalp the bear, scalp the golden bear, take the axe to his lair, scalp the bear, Stanford Indian. This Indian business has been brewing for a long time. Anza, when he passed from San Jose to San Francisco on his first visit here in 1792, remarked upon the astonishing number of Indians he saw. You should pay a visit to the Stanford Museum. Go to see the Indian relics, arrowheads, decorative oyster shells, and other paraphernalia scattered about in the numerous showcases serve to remind us that this redskin tradition is the oldest one we have. Quite large Indian mounds where it seems dead Digger Indians were buried, occupied commanding positions all over the peninsula. In fact, there was one on the Stanford property near Mayfield. It was quite a stamping ground for the old Indian grads of the 18th century. So there has been always plenty of opportunity for the Indian to figure in Stanford tradition. And now, after all the apathy and opposition, the Stanford Indian has come into his own. May we long sing, scalp the bear, Stanford Indian. So that was their rationale for why we should have a Stanford Indian. And thus the Stanford Indian was born conceived in a racist, demeaning, distorting ideas. A scalper society escorted by a drum. That drum was a beer keg. Stereotyping Indians. An Indian chant, which was all about scalping people, scalping bears. The Indian business had been brewing for a long time, starting with the Spanish arrival with Anza from San Jose to San Francisco in 1792. They said there was an astonishing number of Indians he saw. No tribal name except Digger. And in California, when you call an Indian person a digger, you're using the word we can't say, the N-word. They were just Indians, no name. When I got to Stanford, they couldn't tell me the name of the people who lived there and still live there. And they couldn't tell you at the beginning. But they could tell you all those Digger Indians were now Stanford Indians. Go to the Stanford Museum. It's all about relics and arrowheads and oyster shells and paraphernalia. It's all about Indian mounds. These Indian mounds were burial grounds that they dug up and they brought in to their museum, that they partied on and danced on, and that they asked that that tradition be equivalent. These mounds were all over the peninsula. They were on Stanford's grounds themselves. And he said it was quite a stomping ground, and it was a place that you should go and visit. So there's always been, these two gentlemen say, so there has been always plenty of opportunity for the Indian to figure in Stanford tradition. And we are going to make that the Stanford Red Indian. The tradition, Indians as diggers, Indians as relics, Indians as nameless things that you can visit at the museum on Stanford. He goes on to talk about the colorful qualities of the Indians' costumes and customs would go well at rallies, and the war dances that could be held around the bonfire that we will now be able to do because we're Stanford Indians. He doesn't talk about clothes that Indian people wear. No, he talks about costumes, dressing up to be like that anybody can put on the costume and not the clothes. He doesn't talk about culture. They don't talk about cultures or lifestyles, only that they'll be good at rallies. And he talks about war dances around a bonfire, reinforcing stereotyping and a Hollywood image. This was the official beginning of the Stanford mascot in 1930 and 31, because they were honoring Indians, and this was our honor. When I got to Stanford in 1971, I asked, who lived here? And they said, Indians, Digger Indians. I said, no, Ohlone people. Ohlone people live here. They still live here. No one knew their name. They don't care to know their name. It's only the Stanford Indians, the Diggers. So between 1930 and 1972, the mascot has always been held up as a great honor for American Indian people. Because of time limitations, we're now fast forwarding to 1972. In 1972, 55 Native American students and staff at Stanford presented a petition to the university ombudsman, Lois Amsterdam. And she presented that petition to President Richard Lyman, and President Richard Lyman dropped the Indian symbol at Stanford University in 1972. The Stanford Student Senate voted 18-4 to drop the Indian symbol. The petition presented to the ombudsman asked for several things. They urged the use of the Indian symbol be permanently discontinued. that the name the Stanford Indians displayed has a lack of understanding, and that Stanford had placed the name of a race as entertainment, and race is not an entertainment, so they asked that it be changed and deleted. They, when Lois Amsterdam forwarded the petition to President Lyman, she said this: Stanford's continued use of the Indian symbol in the 1970s brings up to visibility a painful lack of sensitivity and awareness on the part of the university. All of us have, in some way, by action or inaction, accepted and supported the use of the Indian symbol on campus. She went on to write that Stanford's mascot symbol was a reflection of our society's retarded understanding, dulled perception, and clouded visions, and forwarded it to the president. A second demand in the petition was regarding the mascot Prince Lightfoot and the Dolly's cheerleaders. And that demand was that a major part of the symbol's use involves Prince Tim Williams Lightfoot and the Stanford Dollies. Neither the mascot nor their cheerleaders wear traditional dress, and their performances are degrading to the Indian population of the Stanford community. Lightfoot is especially insulting to the Plains Indian students, for the mascots' dances and costumes are improperly designed after their traditional practices and dress. So they asked that he no longer be able to perform, as the athletic department said, at games. From 1951 until 1972, Prince Lightfoot, portrayed by Tim Williams, a Yurok Indian of northwestern California, was their official mascot. He was a river Yurok, and he was the mascot for 20 years. He was the chairman of the California Rural Indian Health Board, and he helped start the National Indian Health Board. There were three major symbols of the Stanford mascot. The first one, which was the big-nosed Indian. Then they later made one into a Plains Indian, but without a big nose. And then this is the mascot, Prince Lightfoot, in the dress that he's in. Those were the main ways, that common manifestations that there were. So I came to Stanford, and I joined with the other students, and we were told it was an honor to have an Indian mascot. To be chosen as the symbol of a great university is very honorable. That this action was, that we were being used, that this was really the action of the Stanford radical left fringe, and they're just using a bunch of gullible young real Indians for their own purposes. They claimed that Prince Lightfoot performed a traditional Yurok tribal dance in traditional regalia, and he performed at games without taking a break, and that all of us Indians were just taking this personal, and we should just get over it. But it was personal. I am part Yurok. I'm enrolled in the Hupa tribe through my mother, but my father is Karuk and Yurok, and we only allow enrollment in one citizenship in one tribe. My grandmother, my father's mother, was a river Yurok also. My father was born in a Yurok town of Morik, which is on the Yurok River, which is upriver from where the mascot's family comes from. My father's father, my grandfather, was Tim Williams' friend and fellow political worker. When I was a child, we went to Dad's camp. Dad's camp was where Mr. Williams lived and his family lived. We went to Dad's camp at the mouth of the Klamath River in California, in Yurok territory. After I married my husband, who's a Hupa tribal member, he and I took our children and we went to the mouth of the river, which is where Dad's camp is located, of the Klamath River, to go eeling during the eeling season. It was personal. It was very personal to me. It was very personal to the Plains Indian students who watched him do this dance and put a hex on the other tribe. That was personal. I had never seen poor Tim do this dance or this thing until somebody said, let's go watch. They were playing the Trojans. And this Trojan comes out on this big, huge white horse when they're at home. And he got out there and he did his dance and he put a hex on the horse and on the something else. And I walked away from there shaking my head saying, I am going to take a stand against this. And it was personal because I had to go against my grandfather. I had to go against my grandmother and her cousins who had married into that family. I had to tell them why I was going to do this. It was very personal. What were some of the reasons? The dress. You see how this is dressed? We don't dress like that. We have manasatans. We have kasekoks. We have wolf blinds. We have jump dances and world renewal and deerskin dances and women's dances called flower dances. We don't dance like this. We don't dress like this. It's nothing like this. But as Stanford told me, Stanford Indians dress like this. And everybody who goes to Stanford is a Stanford Indian. So this is okay. It required a personal discussion and a personal sacrifice to be able to stand to do this. But all of us, all of the students that were involved in this had to make, it was personal, and they had to make what was at that time the right answer. Because the Ohlone people in California are not even recognized as a tribe by the federal government. They're not, and they don't have the same ability to interact and are left out of things that other tribes can do. So one of the things that happened is that when we decided to do this, and we had to take this stand against the exploitation, it was very difficult. But as students, we decided that it had to be done so that in the future, if we had other tribal members going to Stanford, they wouldn't have to face these issues. Well, my daughter went to Stanford many years after I did, and bringing back the mascot raised its ugly head when she was there. And then 2 years ago, we had a tribal member go to Stanford. We've had 3 or 4 tribal members go to Stanford, and they're raising, once again, bringing back the mascot. So this issue is still here today, but, you know, they still don't know the name of the tribe from there. We're still Diggers, or now we're all Stanford Indians. So my question is, why we never understood this when we were going through this. They accused us of it being personal to Indian people, but when you said stop the Stanford mascot, it was personal to them. Thank you.
Pass that to Bruce. Thank you, that was marvelous. Our next speaker is Bruce Duthu. And we've heard mention today already of one person who was at Dartmouth during the time of the change there, and that's Dr. Michael Doris, the wonderful writer. And another person who was there at the time was Dwayne Birdbear, a Mandan Hidatsa native person who was sort of the student organizer. And he's the person who coined the phrase cultural drag to mean when people dress up like Indians and act the fool and go woo, woo, woo. And Bruce knew them and knew all the other people and was part of that effort to get rid of the so-called native references and to fight back the people who are trying to bring back the Indian to Big Green whenever they can. So, Bruce.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank Suzanne and the organizers of this conference for inviting me again, since this was to be scheduled last November. And I'm one of those that has to leave a little early to try to beat the snowstorm back to New England. So I hope that that can happen. I'm going to talk about some of the themes that were raised this morning. The savage, the native as savage. And I'm going to talk about it in the context of embedding savagery in symbols and law. One of the things I should mention by way of background is that I'm a lawyer, and I'm now a professor, but before that, I tell my students this is my fourth or fifth profession, depending on how you count. But as Suzanne said, I'm from the Houma tribe in southern Louisiana, coastal community. And like the Ohlone people, my people are not federally recognized for many complicated reasons. That's for another conference that I hope we can have, actually, maybe here at this museum. And I went to Dartmouth as a student. I arrived on the campus in 1975 on a recruitment trip. Dartmouth at that time and still today has a very, very aggressive recruitment program where they fly Native students, high school students, to visit the campus, attend classes, talk with other Native kids about their experiences there. So I was one of those recruited back in the mid-'70s, and lo and behold, to my shock, I got in. So I joined the campus in 1976, and so to use one of the phrases from this morning, I arrived during the afterlife phase. The symbol had already been officially discontinued, or the administration had voted to discontinue the use of the symbol as antithetical to the spirit of community and inclusion and diversity. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Like Lois, I want to give you a little bit of background about Dartmouth's association with Indian imagery. And it goes back to its founding purpose. Some of you may know this history, but many of you may not. Dartmouth is an old institution going back to 1769. Its charter from the British Crown states that it was founded in part for the education of the youth of the Indian tribes and British youth and others. So for 200 years, it was those others who really got the education. Because in 200 years, from 1769 to 1969, less than 20 Native students actually received degrees from Dartmouth. Many more attended, but most didn't graduate. Our best estimates is about 19 Native students graduated from Dartmouth in those 200 years. People like Charles Eastman, well-known, Lakota, but not a very good track record. And that changed quite dramatically in the late 60s and early 70s for a wide range of reasons, including the activism of the 60s, where institutions of higher learning could no longer ignore or keep the curtain closed on their own abysmal failures of diversifying their student bodies. Dartmouth, like most institutions, were predominantly white, and Dartmouth was all male, and was all male until 1972. So in that spirit of activism, the college inaugurated a new president in 1970, a mathematician named John Kemeny, who himself had some education to go through in terms of, if we do welcome these new folks onto our campus, what will that entail? What will happen if we invite in significant numbers African Americans and Native Americans to our campus? What will be entailed with that? There had been a handful of students, Native students, on Dartmouth's campus prior to the formal beginning, or we call it the recommitment to Indian education in 1970. And one of those students who was already on the Dartmouth campus happened to be back on campus this week. This is very timely because we're celebrating our 40th anniversary as an academic program at Dartmouth College. Native American Studies was founded in 1972, and one of the people who spurred the, in addition to Dwayne Birdbear, was Howard Badhan, a rosebud from Lakota. And Howard was on our campus just this week, and he told some profound stories along with people like Dave Bonga, an Anishinaabe from Minnesota, Drew Rice, a Mohawk, grew up in the south side of Chicago, actually, and a classmate of Justice Sotomayor on the U.S. Supreme Court when they were at Yale together, and Michael Hanachek, a Choctaw. Those 4 individuals were on a panel earlier this week and educated our current generation of Native students and the current generation of Dartmouth students generally about our origin story. And that's what we call the panel, an origin story, because it really was a new beginning for the college. Howard told a story about when he was taken in by President Kimeny, who had just about to assume the presidency. And President Kimeny invited him into his office, just the two of them. And he asked Howard to sit in the president's chair. And he sat on the opposite side. And he said, imagine that you're the president of Dartmouth. And I'm listening to you to figure out what do we need to do to welcome Native students to Dartmouth. And Howard had lots of answers because they had been talking amongst themselves about what they saw when they arrived on the Dartmouth campus. This kind of imagery, for example. Imagery where white kids dressed up, the cultural drag that Dwayne coined, at football games and other sporting events. Something that actually has a very recent history. Most Dartmouth folks don't know how recent the actual use and incorporation of Indian imagery in their sporting teams, in terms of Indians on helmets and jerseys, is relatively recent. But references to Dartmouth as Indians began in the first third of the 20th century. So this is not a long, long history. But at Dartmouth, the motto is, if it happens twice, it's a tradition. So this is a long-standing tradition because some bits of it trace back to the 60s. So that makes it a very, very long-standing tradition. So Howard, and then in 1970, he was joined by a group of 15 guys. This was the first class recruited under the recommitment era of the Kimeny administration. And this is the group that included Drew and David and so forth. So they arrive on the Dartmouth campus. They go to one football game, and they see these kinds of things. These are in the programs that you could get, and they always archive everything, so you can always look back in time and see how this was folded in terms of this is the football program. And so they would always do these clever little takes on Indian imagery to scalp Brown or Harvard and so forth. Another one from 1961. So within really a matter of months after being on the Dartmouth campus, these guys were not wallflowers at all. Many of them had already been very active on the national scene. And so they organized very quickly and made a list of demands to the administration. And they said, the first thing you have to decide is, do you want real Indians on this campus or your cartoon Indians? Because you cannot have both. They actually, not too many months after that, drew a line in the sand and said, unless you do change, none of us are coming back next fall. And you're going to look pretty stupid. You're making all this hoopla about rededicating yourself to American Indians and Indian education, and what if none of us come back? So they really were quite activists. And I was so happy for our current students to hear descriptions about what activism really means on the ground. Because these are folks committing themselves to a cause and going beyond their own personal self-interest. Their personal self-interest is a bit of that. But a couple of them admitted, they said, well, we got kicked out because we were so busy doing this that we forgot to be students. And Howard was one of those. So the list of demands included, number one, you have to get rid of this symbol. Number two, you have to start an academic program in American Indian Studies. Not for us. We know what we're about. It's for you guys, because we're surrounded by a sea of ignorance. Not malevolence necessarily, but massive ignorance. Didn't know there were any Indians still left in the U.S. Didn't know there were any Indians in the Northeast, and so on. They also wanted demands for a structure, programmatic structure. You can't bring students on campus without some sort of support structure. And this is, to Dartmouth's credit, and all of these guys paid tribute to the positive institutional changes that Dartmouth did bring about. The creation, for example, of a Native American program. This is the Student Support Network with a director, a position that today is endowed, actually, by a Dartmouth alum. They did create an American Indian Studies program in 1972. They created what we call the Native American Visiting Committee. This is a group of alumni who come back regularly. In most of the 70s and 80s, this committee came back twice a year. Now it comes once a year. But they are advisory to the president. They have a direct pipeline to the Dartmouth president. And what they do when they come to campus is they meet with the students, they meet with administrators, they meet with the faculty, and they hear, how are we doing? And they put all of this in their report to the president. I thought that was a very far-reaching institutional development to entrench Dartmouth's recommitment. So you might say, well, where were the problems then? That sounds pretty good. You're recruiting Native kids. You've already beat the record almost in terms of how many Native students have graduated within a few years. We had already broken the record from the previous 200 years. That didn't take much effort. But where were the problems? The problems were in the afterlife. Those alumni, mostly, and current students who felt that something had been taken from them. Now, they could never really articulate what that something was, but you've heard some of the elements of that story this morning. Integrated or incorporated with a sense of identity. They had somehow melded their sense of being at Dartmouth with being a Dartmouth Indian. I remember an alum telling me, you know, this has nothing to do with you people, to my face, in the 1970s. He says, this has nothing to do with you people. This is an aesthetic. And it calls back to our founding purpose. I said, oh, founding purpose, that does have something to do with me, because I'm here because of that founding purpose. Why would I have left the bayou to go to New England where it snows? A lot. Well, climate change is helping to change some of that. But you know, this afterlife thing was serious business. And as Lois said, it was very personal. And people who were on the front lines experienced some pretty horrible things. So even while we had these institutional structures that to the outside eye would seem quite progressive, and they were for their era, they were very progressive, the on-the-ground story was much more negative and difficult. Suzanne mentioned one of my mentors, a mentor to all of us in those days, Michael Doris. Michael was the first chair of Native American Studies, so my predecessor in that role. You cannot imagine the kinds of things that Michael experienced in that role, where how many arrows he took for us. Alumni coming to his office, white men, and you would think that these people are sane. But there's a story, and Michael didn't burden us with this. I only learned this many years later. 3 men showed up at his office door one day, opened their jackets, all had the Indian head T-shirt, and yelled, "Wahoo Wah," which was one of our war chants, and urinated on his floor. These are Ivy Leaguers.
There's no hope for us.
Really. So, and I could go on and on with other kinds of indignities that would have just been all the excuse all of us would have needed to leave and never set foot. None of us needed to endure that kind of indignity. And yet we persisted because we believed in what the college wanted to do, which was to play an active, meaningful role in the education of Native students. But they also knew that this was going to be very hard because there would be lots of resistance. And there was. Many of us who went to the football games and seeing how quickly politicized being a Native student on the Dartmouth campus could be, it was a very difficult and challenging time. And the more you protested, the more some of us fell by the wayside, like Howard. Not all of us were suspended, but we paid a price because you had to decide, do you go to that protest or do you study for your English exam for the next day? All of us had to make that choice in terms of where do you devote your time. Very, very precious time. Let me, as Lois, because of time, move forward and say that, in those intervening years, from the early 70s to the present, there have been tremendous gains. The college can now boast of an Native alumni population of over 800. Pretty impressive. Many of them are here in Washington. Many of them are my former students. The first work-study kid I ever hired when I went back to Dartmouth to be the director of the Native American program, which is the student advisory body, the first thing Dartmouth created. The very first student that I hired as a work-study student was Hillary Tompkins. I don't think Hillary's here today. Hillary's a solicitor of the Department of Interior, the top lawyer in the entire Department of the Interior. Jody Archambault, Gillette, President Obama's chief policy advisor on Indian Affairs, class of '91. And the list goes on in terms of very, very prominent Native graduates who have gone on either to service in the federal government or the state government or their own tribal governments as political leaders, as educators, as doctors, as business people, as teachers, and now even a professor, or at least they call me professor. But let me finish up by saying where I really feel some of the real dangers come from, beyond just the personal impact on people in their lives as students and the culture of academic institutions, is this process of embedding savagery in symbols and in law. There's a very insidious quality to this process of viewing Native peoples as savages, as playthings, as a dead society who have now become part of the public domain. Because if you have a non-living, a dead culture, society somehow feels at liberty to go foraging through their archives and use whatever bits and pieces, including the dress-up bits, to play Indian. And when that happens with the point of law, it's one thing for the college campuses to endure these sorts of things, but when that savagery becomes embedded in law, as it is, you have some real problems. Let me just give you a couple of examples. The very first case involving land rights of Native peoples, a case called Johnson versus McIntosh, which I'm sure Lee teaches about all the time, relies principally on this rhetoric of Indian savagery to justify the taking away of native lands and saying that you could never have been the owners because of your societal inferiority, the savagery. John Marshall didn't mince any words. Fierce savages. And to leave them in control of this land would be to leave this land a wilderness. That's almost a direct quote from Johnson versus McIntosh. A case closer to Oklahoma, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, 1903, justified the unilateral abrogation of treaties. We don't need to go back to tribes and renegotiate treaties for further land cessions. We can just help ourselves to it. Why? Because of their inferiority, their savagery, their dependency on the United States. And more currently, 1978, a case called Oliphant versus Suquamish, that held that Indian tribes can't prosecute non-Indians. And when you think about who's committing violent crime against Native women, just as one example, sexual violence against Native women, 4 out of 5 offenders are non-Indians. And the governments closest to the problem are disempowered from doing anything about it because of the Supreme Court's ruling. As many of you know, Congress has a bill pending in it right now the reauthorization of VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, that would include provisions to restore this power of tribes to prosecute all offenders in the limited context of sexual crimes. At least on the House side, they're objecting to that because it is beyond Congress's power. Suddenly, Congress doesn't have power to do what it wants in Indian affairs, to manipulate tribal sovereignty, what I call Play-Doh sovereignty. Let's make it what we want, that we can tolerate. Well, and one last sort of embedded savagery. If I could show you an org chart of the Department of the Interior, I always show this to my students. Notice where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is. Who else is in the Department of the Interior? Fish and Wildlife. You know, animals. And that to me hits home in terms of mascots. Who gets to be a mascot in the U.S.? Animals and Indians. Who's paired together in the federal architecture? Animals and Indians. That's embedded savagery. That's the extent to which we really need to expunge that kind of attitude in our structure. Thank you.
That was terrific, Bruce. Thank you so much. Another Dartmouth alum was Mateo Romero, who's one of our top native painters, and he was one of the original plaintiffs in our lawsuit against the dreadful name of the Washington football team. And he joined a distinguished group that included Vine Deloria and Norbert Hill, Manly Begay, who you heard earlier, Bill Means, Lakota, and Ray Apodaca. And we refer to that as the old people's case, even though Mateo is very young. And that's been taken over now by the young people, and we wish them well, Amanda Blackhorse and the 18 to 24-year-olds who have taken up the same case, and there'll be a hearing in the Blackhorse case against the Washington franchise on March 7th. Before the U.S. Patent and Trademark Board Trial and Trademark Trial and Appeals Board, the TTAB judges. These are the judges who know what they're talking about when it comes to trademarks. And so if you're here in the local area, turn out for the March 7 hearing. Speaking of taking arrows for us, Delise O'Mealy has done that. And more, and we owe her at least a shield. She has really done quite a remarkable job with the NCAA in dealing with some of these hostile and abusive names and behaviors and symbols. And she's going to go through very quickly what she is able to say. You know, everyone sues the NCAA, so there are some things that she's not able to cover, but she'll share with us what she can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on the NCAA's policy on the use of Native American mascots at our championship events. And I'll use this next several minutes to give you just a brief overview of the policy, talk about how it was adopted, the colleges and the universities that were impacted by the policy, the reactions that we got after the policy was implemented, and then where we are today. Let me provide some of the background and a little bit of the historical perspective on the genesis and the evolution of this policy. But it's also equally important that you understand a little bit about the structure of the NCAA that will shed some light for you on why we went about the policy the way we did. The NCAA is a membership-driven organization. We are comprised of over 1,200 colleges and universities and conferences all across the country. All of our rules, regulations, and policies are initiated and adopted by our member institutions. So the issue of the use of Native American mascots and nicknames and imagery in college sports was first introduced to the NCAA around about 2001. There were several key events that prompted our discussions, and this included an internal request from our membership to review the issue, as well as a very strongly worded statement at the time from the United States Commission on Civil Rights calling for an end to the use of Native American images and team names by non-Native schools. So if you think about our membership structure, we carefully studied this issue for 4 years. We engaged our membership, we have a very vast committee structure, and we worked directly with all of those institutions that carried these nicknames and these images. Our study included review of numerous articles, consultation with experts, testimonials from tribal groups and members, student athletes, the NCAA membership, and the general public. Additionally, each of these institutions was asked to complete a self-study that described its use of these references, the impact that had on student athletes, on the campus community, on the Native American people, and then on the general public at large. As we researched this issue, there was overwhelming evidence of the potential harm created by the continued use of Native American mascots, nicknames, imagery, and logos. Additionally, we received letters and statements and resolutions from numerous Native American tribes, organizations, and agencies that corroborated this research data. The pervasiveness of the use of these nicknames, as well as the documented harm to the Native American people, and the very, very strong opposition to continued use from those that we saw were affected the most, persuaded the NCAA to focus its attention on this issue. Ultimately, the decision by our highest ranking committee, which is the NCAA Executive Committee, was grounded in 3 constitutional principles for the NCAA. First of all, our principle of non-discrimination, which calls on our members to promote an atmosphere of respect for and sensitivity to the dignity of every person. Then we have a principle of cultural diversity and gender equity, which requires colleges and universities to establish and maintain an environment that values these elements. And finally, the principle of sportsmanship and ethical conduct, which speaks to the enhancement of integrity in higher education and the promotion of civility in society. So before I go much further, let me set the stage for our discussion by outlining the specifics of our policy, what it does and what it doesn't do. And I would note that we received quite a bit of criticism on both sides of the coin on this. There were those that said the NCAA had far outstepped and overreached its boundaries, and there were others who said the NCAA just had not gone far enough. As a membership-driven organization, we operate by carefully balancing these issues that require national governance and those issues that we believe should be left to institutional autonomy. And so the policy relates specifically to NCAA championship and postseason events, events that we control. Does not relate to regular season competition or to conference championships that are controlled by other groups. And then, while the NCAA strongly discouraged the use of these nicknames and imagery and mascots, the policy did not mandate that an institution had to change its nickname or its mascot as a condition of membership. So essentially, what the policy does, it impacts an institution's ability to host an NCAA championship. It required those who were awarded championships previously to cover all such references. It precluded the use of these names and imagery on uniforms during our championship events, and also precluded the appearance of mascots, precluded the names and imagery on band and cheerleader dance uniforms, etc. As I noted, what it doesn't do is it does not preclude an institution that had this imagery from participating in our championship. They just could not wear or bring any of the paraphernalia. Does not require an institution to change its nickname, and then does not govern regular season competition. We strongly believe that our championship events should promote an atmosphere of respect and sensitivity for the dignity of every person, and this included participating student athletes, students on campus, fans, and other supporters of college sports. So those institutions that encouraged a culture of racial stereotyping through the use of these imagery would not be able to host NCAA championships. At the time of the adoption of our policy, there were about 20 institutions that were subject to the parameters of the policy. These institutions had some variation of imagery, some nicknames, or some other clear association with Native American culture. Since 2005, several institutions chose to change their nicknames or their mascots and to remove the corresponding imagery. Now, very early in the process, we were faced with situations where an institution carried a very specific tribal name, and the local tribe in question was supportive of the use of that name. This resulted in an exception to our policy, and we were roundly criticized also for creating this exception to the policy. Institutions that could demonstrate endorsement by these tribes were then no longer subject to the parameters of the policy. It was a very, very difficult discussion for us because although the committee continued to believe that stereotyping Native Americans through nicknames and the imagery was wrong, it recognized that a Native American tribe is a distinct political community and therefore respected the authority of the tribe to permit the university or the college to use its name. We also recognize that there were disagreements among Native American people on these issues. And so whenever a tribe endorsed the use of the name, the NCAA deferred to the judgment and the will of that tribe. Another interesting question for us was how to handle kind of generic names. So even in the absence of specific imagery, generic names like Indians or Braves were widely recognized as stereotypical references to Native American people. And so these institutions were viewed through somewhat of a different lens than those that adopted specific tribal names. We agree that while both representations contribute to the perpetuation of a one-dimensional stereotype of Native American people, we found that generic references had an even wider impact. And as we did our research, and this was mentioned earlier today as well as this morning, we found that along with eagles, tigers, bulldogs, and lions, the term Indians was one of the most widely used athletic team nicknames in the country. So when our policy was adopted in 2005, there was immediate reaction. Initially, the loudest voices were primarily negative. We were accused of venturing into social justice issues beyond the scope of our authority. Headlines read, "Political correctness run amok, NCAA has other things to worry about. NCAA does not belong in the social change arena. This should be dealt with at the campus or the local level." Then people who were affiliated with the institutions were saying to us, the way we use the symbols, imagery, it's not negative. We're honoring Native Americans. We don't find it to be offensive. Of course, it's part of our tradition. They told us that what we would do next is eliminate tigers and bears if we went as far as to eliminate Native American mascots. Many of these calls I took personally. My integrity was questioned. I was called stupid. It was really quite a trying circumstance and situation for us in the 9 months that led just after the policy was adopted. But eventually, a chorus of voices started to grow. And these were voices that were offering very positive comments, and they got louder. And they were saying things like, "You did the right thing," that this would have positive impact on our lives. One of the quotes that stuck with me, and it stuck with me because it was very early in the process, while all we were hearing in the media and from the many telephone calls and the emails that we were getting anonymously. And I'll just say this, when you can send an anonymous email, you could say just about anything, is what I've discovered. And they did. They said just about anything, and I responded to them. But the quote that stuck with me was from a young woman, and she said, "You've made the right decision. And when it comes to an issue as divisive as this, the right decision is always the hardest decision to uphold. The people of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe would like to offer their sincerest thanks." It was one of the first. We had many others after, but it stuck with me because it was just the most positive message that we had heard. So where we are today. On the slide in front of you are the institutions that were originally impacted by the policy. We have continued to have dialogue with them over the past 8 years. We've been through congressional hearings, legal cases, settlement agreements, a lot of media attention. We have received criticism as well as praise. The NCAA policy is still effective, now 7 or 8 years later, and we believe that we have in some small way helped to reduce stereotyping and discrimination, at least within the sphere of our control. On this slide, you'll see in red the nicknames as they existed previously, and those that changed their names, I've indicated the current nicknames. Some of them were generic nicknames. They removed all imagery and moved away from representing that nickname as a Native American nickname like the William and Mary Tribe. The ones on the right are those institutions that sought and received endorsement from specific tribes. Basically, we called it the namesake tribe endorsement. I thank you for your interest and for your support, even for your disagreement, because it's only with open and honest dialogue that we can move forward. I anticipate your questions.
Well, thank you very much for all your hard work and for that presentation. I'd like to point out that there are heroes on every one of these campaigns to get rid of the local mascot or the local name, and some of them have been mentioned here before, but I wanted to mention one from the University of Illinois, Marcus Zammerman, who was the very first Native artist to oppose Chief Olenowik, and he did so publicly in the newspaper and was vilified to such an extent and had so many death threats that he had to leave the school. And that work was carried on as by Debbie Reese and lots of Native students there, and they did a wonderful job. And with the Fighting Sioux in its death throes now, Jesse Taken Alive and others who worked so hard to bring that about. And one thing that you've seen that's really interesting is a shift from the people who are the frontline people who really take the hardest hit on all of this are the students, the Native students on each of these campuses. And there's been a shift by people who want to hang on to these mascots and these symbols to saying, well, if the local tribe doesn't find a problem, then we're fine with it. You should be fine with it. And they've taken it out of the hands, in some cases, of the students and put it in the hands of a tribe who will be complicit in the bad acts that are committed against the students. So this is complicated, and a power dynamic has shifted in some cases that is undesirable. So while we do good things in one area, we're not protecting the people who need the most protection in all of these efforts, and those are the students, because they're the ones taking it every day and whose lives are being threatened and who are being vilified and held up to ridicule every day. One of the people who introduced legislation, who did it another way, tried to introduce legislation, did what he could when he was in the Senate, and the owner moved the team out of the District of Columbia because of it, and I'll let him tell that tale. Ben Nighthorse Campbell.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you. As Suzanne knows, I'm a retired U.S. Senator about halfway through my 10-step recovery program, and I'm almost well. Some can stay for life, but I couldn't. And most of us on this panel, we come from a people in which cars, candy bars, beer, tobacco, and T-shirts are all named after us and marketed using our image, but we don't get many benefits from those. We come from a people in which hundreds, if not thousands, of small towns, particularly in the American West, if you pick up any Chamber of Commerce brochure, they use our image. In the same area where we have 70 to 80% or more unemployment, and our kids are 10 times more likely to commit suicide than anybody else in the United States. So there's no question we've been used a lot in American history. Probably because we didn't have a way of communicating other than our own language in the olden days. And by the way, I noticed our nice lady here using sign language. Many of those signs are the same in Indian Sign Language, and sometimes we watch them and we can understand some of the things she's saying because Indian Sign Language is very similar. But I don't want to digress. I often wonder, about the difficulty of changing names, and almost everybody's talked about that. And I think it's ingrained in us several things. First of all, Americans are kind of raised from childhood to be loyal to the team, to your team. And so you're loyal to your elementary school football team and your high school basketball team and your college team and so on. And whenever somebody tinkers around with your team, it gets everybody on the fight. We have some pretty interesting names in the state of Colorado, my home state. But some names, in India, are just great on all of us. Redskins is not the only one. Savage, Squaw, and Buck, those four are considered just terrible names to most Indian people because we know where they came from. Most people on the outside, meaning non-Indian, don't know where they came from, don't know where they originated from, and nobody did mention that here, and I didn't sit in the earlier panels, but maybe somebody did mention it in the earlier panels. Redskin came from the time when bounties were given for Indian people during the French and English War, when all you had to do was turn in some black hair or a patch of skin and you could get paid for it. That's where it came from. Who wants to be remembered for that? Nobody I know. And Squaw, Buck, and Savage are equally terrible names. It's difficult to change, partly because of this loyalty kids grow up with. But I have to tell you, I think in some cases, too, it's because of cowardice on the behalf of elected officials. They tend to lean very heavily towards getting reelected, as you probably know. And not many will stand up and do the right thing if they think it's very unpopular. University of Illinois was mentioned. I remember Paul Simon, former Senate friend of mine from years and years ago, when he came out publicly about changing the symbol of the University of Illinois, Chief Illini or whatever they're called up there. He showed me some of the hate mail he got, and you absolutely wouldn't believe it. Death threats, hate mail like you would not believe.
Some of those.
Yes, I'll bet. And when I introduced the bill that Suzanne mentioned, and by the way, I didn't pursue that bill when the owner of the Redskins decided to move to Landover. But when I introduced that bill, I got some very, very angry mail and calls too. But if I could talk to them personally, and I noticed obviously that if that person was a Hispanic American or a Black American or Chinese American or something, and I asked him, you might say, to walk in our shoes for a while, and they would complain, that's my team, you shouldn't be trying to change the name, and I support that team, that kind of thing. And I would say to him, you're an African American, how would you like us to change the name of that team to the Washington Darkies? Or something like that. And they say, oh God, you can't do that. But you know as well as I do, everybody in this audience knows as well as I do, there is a derogatory nickname for every ethnic group, I think, in the world, and certainly in this country, whether you're Irish, whether you're German, whether you're Black American, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're Chinese, you name it. There's some kind of a derogatory word that simply shouldn't be used. I think the African Americans have taken the lead on that by creating an awareness among all Americans. The N word is a no-no, as simple as that. Well, there are many other words almost equally as bad that should be no-nos, but we haven't had the stature or the political clout or the so on to make more people aware of it. But elected officials, seems to me, through benign neglect and a worry that they might not get reelected, are really headed for the tall grass on this one, and I have to commend Mayor Vincent Gray, who just a couple of weeks ago said publicly that the Washington Redskins needed to, I wrote it down, in fact, they needed to consider changing their name before coming back to Washington, and they should. Now, I personally don't have a problem with the team. I was an athlete. I was in the Olympic Games of 1964. Suzanne didn't mention that, but I know a little bit about sports. I know something about sports. And so I'm a big supporter of athletes, no matter where they are. I know the kind of training they went through. I know the injuries. I know the difficulty, the healing process, and the long-term effect of having a bad back and bad knees and everything else because you committed yourself for 10 years of being on the field or on the mats or somewhere. In addition to that, Mike Shanahan is a personal friend of mine. Remember, he was a coach for the Broncos for years, and he was a political supporter of mine, a fine man. I think the world of him, and the team too. I don't like the name. And that's the real rub. It's the name. Now, there have been all kinds of questions raised about the use of names. Some people say, well, wait a minute. There's Indian teams that call themselves Indian names, like the Chiefs or the Warriors, something of that nature. Well, that's right, they do. I know a number of high school Indian school teams that call themselves names like that, not these brutal names that I mentioned a while ago. But Indian people are not just a racial minority, they're also a form of government, a sovereign government as defined in the U.S. Constitution. They can do that. And so if a tribe like the Seminoles reaches an agreement with a university in Florida to allow them to use that word Seminole, that's their business, no problem. But I can tell you this, no Seminole, and I'm not Seminole, but I know I can speak for them on this, they would not support the use of any of those four names that I mentioned. So those are individual cases where a tribe and a school may reach some kind of an agreement, as Delise mentioned. That's okay with me too. If it's all right with them, it's okay with me. But the heading for the tall grass on behalf of a lot of elected officials, I think is just inexcusable. There are over 100 names of federal locations using the word Squaw. Squaw Valley, California, where the 1960 Olympic Games were held, is one you might mention. But there's, Squaw Peak, Squaw Valley, Squaw Lake, Squaw this, Squaw that, and so on. You track where that word Squaw originated. It's from one of the northeastern tribes, and it defines, in a longer word, a part of a woman's anatomy. Nobody wants to use that word for crying out loud for a location if they knew what it meant, but nobody has taken that on. And I thought about it and did a little bit of survey when I was, still in the Senate and wanting to make some change. But boy, I'll tell you, the difficulty of changing hundreds of names nationwide and changing the maps and running into the bureaucracy and all the local opposition and everything else, I just couldn't get enough support in the Senate to take on those kinds of things. But those should be changed too. So it's not just a matter of teams, they should be too. There are a number of schools, I think there are different levels of how bad the names are. In Colorado, we have 3 different high school teams that have 3 different names. One are Montrose, Colorado, they call themselves the Indians. Another one, Lamar, Colorado, call themselves the Savages. And another one, Arapahoe High School, calls themselves the Warriors. In the case of the Arapahoe High School, they went to the Arapahoe tribe of Wyoming and talked to them and asked them to help them find some kind of common ground, and the Arapahoe tribe did. And every year, the Arapahoe tribe sends delegates to the school where they have some seminars on cultural diversity and the history of the Arapahoe people, and it's a pretty nice relationship. But the school never tried to do that without working with the Arapahoe tribe. I haven't really, frankly, even though my wife's a graduate of Montrose High School, I never have asked if there's been much opposition to using the name of Indians around Montrose. But the third one, the Lamar Savages, boy, did I get in a tangle over that one years ago when I was in office, when they asked me if I thought that word was offensive, and I said, you bet it's offensive using the word savage. I said, our mothers and fathers and grandparents were not savages, they were Indian people. And whoa, but did I get the hate mail from some of the people, and so I said to them in a dialogue with the supporters of that, I said, it's okay, you want to use the word savage? It's fine if you want to be a savage. Use your own picture. They didn't do that. They didn't do that. But I thought, you want to use your photograph up there and say your mother and father were savages? Okay, but don't use our people. But then the second line of defense for him was saying, oh no, what we really meant was noble savages. Oh yeah, okay, sure. We've all heard that before. So I know we have a long way to go. But clearly, the enlightened universities that have already changed their name, and Stanford was one of them mentioned. I was a student doing some graduate work at Stanford. I went to San Jose and then to Stanford. I was there when they were still the Stanford Indians, and many people that were there at the time, they didn't care for that name even then. And like a good enlightened university, they kind of took the lead on changing that name, as others have. So it's a long process, but I think part of it are forums like this. We can explain. You know, walk in our shoes for a while. You'll understand our beliefs. You'll understand what it is to be used in so many different ways in American culture without having almost any recourse. I think maybe one of the other difficulties, too, that we have is, and I remember some of the phone calls I got when I was dealing with the word Redskins, and by the way, I didn't pursue that bill when then owner Jack Kent Cooke decided to move to Landover, but that was one of the reasons he decided to flee the scene and go to Landover. But one of the things I used to get calls in those days, people would say, wait a minute, Senator, I'm part Indian and I don't mind using that name at all. Well, come on, you know, if you've seen Dances with Wolves and you ask, you do a poll afterwards, you find out there's a whole bunch of people who weren't Indian before they saw Dances with Wolves. And it goes away after the movie goes away too, by the way. So that's a real common thing and a pretty poor excuse. But I look at it this way. If you ask a person, let's use the African American experience, who in the world would ever believe something like this? I'm part black and I don't mind using the N-word. Well, you should mind if you don't, and you're probably a liar to begin with. But there are certain words you can't cover up and hide and, you know, dodge around and say, well, it's okay because this or that or the other. They're wrong from the beginning and they're wrong to the end. And maybe I'll probably ought to just leave it there before I start pounding the table here, Suzanne. Suzanne, she's known me a long time. I tend to get my blood up, as they say. But certainly forums like this and the people that are here, when they go back, hopefully you will talk to your friends and neighbors and have them recognize we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And part of it, I think, is maybe our own fault. You know, we didn't have a written language in the olden days. We couldn't defend ourselves, and so we're a culture that, by and large, in American history, was defined by somebody else. We were not able to define ourselves, and only in the 70s, what I call the time of a reawakening of ethnic pride for almost all Americans, that Indian people said, wait a minute, you're not going to define me. I'll tell you who I am. You don't need to try and tell me who I am. And now it's great that we have movies coming out of Hollywood with wonderful Indian actors. Well, most are. I don't know about Johnny Depp. I heard he was adopted into Comanche Nation, so maybe he is now, but he didn't used to be. But we have great Indian actors, and I think we're telling our own story on film and in books and so on. Years ago, I introduced a bill to change the name of the Custer battlefield because it was the only battlefield I could find in the whole United States that was named after the loser instead of the winner. It seemed to me we ought to have equal honor on the battlefield as the soldiers that were up there, and so we changed that name. It wasn't easy. We got a lot of hate mail because of that too, and at that time, before that name was changed, the bookstore at the battlefield would not allow any books written by Indians to be sold in the bookstore. That's a fact. There are now. In fact, I was up there just about a month ago, and there's been a lot of change. Now there's much more access to Indian people writing and telling their side of the story as it was told by their grandfathers and so on. So we're making progress. We just need more help, and we hope everybody in this audience is going to help us do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ben didn't mention that not only was his bill introduced by himself, the only Native person at that time in Congress, but it was also introduced, a companion bill, the identical bill introduced on the House side by civil rights hero John Lewis, Representative Lewis. And I always like to thank people who others might think have no stake in it, who step forward to say, this is my fight too. So I really appreciate that on his behalf, and also that Ben stepped forward and did this. There, many times people say to us, don't you have other more important things to worry about rather than this? Well, we're the people who do those more important things. And the people who ask that question, in my experience, have never done anything to help our people. So I so appreciate the people who have done things to help our people. I want to ask our panelists to make concluding remarks, brief concluding remarks, not brief like the presentations, but where everyone was marvelously eloquent at length. But really brief concluding remarks, things that you want people here in the theater and watching this around the country through the webcam, through the webcast, to what you would like to say to them and what thoughts you would like to leave them with. Lee?
One of the things that I think should be said is that I really don't believe that anybody goes into having any of these mascots, doing any of the things that we've discussed on this panel with evil in their heart. I don't believe that. I like to believe that most people really are at base fine individuals, that if they really understood, that they would come to change. And I think that that's what a forum like this is supposed to do, is to help people to understand so that the better angels of their nature, as a wise man once said, could take hold and they could end up becoming better people themselves and go ahead and drop these. Thank you.
Lois?
Indian people are alive, breathing, living in their homes, both on reservations, off reservations, all over the United States, even Washington, D.C. And that having someone reduced to a mascot and reduced to a symbol so that a whole nother group of people can become Indian and then negate all of these living, breathing, functioning people. We have been here since time immemorial. My grandfather used to tell me, if a redwood tree could grow here, so could an Yurok, Karuk, or Hoopa person. And if we don't get anything else, I think we have to realize that every time we think we can change non-Indian people into Indians by just making them a mascot, we're saying Indian people don't exist and that the ownership belongs to the non-Indian. But we are living people.
Bruce?
I guess my parting suggestion or plea would be to join the project in enhancing our nation's cultural literacy about Native people. And it's quite related to what Lois has just said. Some of you may know this, but there was an event in the early part of the 20th century where Congress set aside some land in Staten Island, a big parcel of land, on which would be built a statue of a young Indian brave. And it was going to be known as the Monument to the Departed Race. There was a big ceremony. Members of Congress, the President of the United States was there, and several old chiefs were trotted out to kind of, I guess, symbolize the passing of these people. We're always planning Native people's funeral, but this was a real funeral. Had this statue been built, and there's a book, Lucy Maddox's book, you can actually see an architectural rendering of this statue. Had it been built, would have been about 15 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty. Now imagine, had that been built, how we would have to explain this to our children and to visitors. What is that statue? We know what Lady Liberty represents, but what's that one over there? And we would have to tell that story. And so in joining the project to enhance our nation's cultural literacy, it's a plea to stop acting as if we had actually built that monument.
So I think for me, this was a tremendous learning experience. I'm a Jamaican national. I was born and I grew up in Jamaica. And I came to this country about 25 years ago. And so I did not experience the anger of the civil rights movement. And I learned about it through history books and reading about it. But I got to experience some of the same venomous behavior when we went through this process in the mid-2000s. And I was amazed that people in this day and age were still so angry, were still so unwilling to put themselves in someone else's shoes, and still unwilling to recognize the pain and suffering that they were causing other people. But saying that, we went through the fight, and we're now in a place much better than we were. And so I would leave you with an encouraging message. I would say that change has been slow. It's painfully slow at times. But keep at it. Keep going. Everyone in this room can be an advocate, no matter age or your background. Beautiful young lady sitting in the front here, she can be an advocate. And hopefully, within the next few years, by the time she is grown up, we won't be talking about these issues.
Amen.
I think we have a little difficult probably than most people, because most people, when they immigrated to these shores, including some of my ancestors on my Anglo side, they were in a position that we sometimes say is upward mobility. In other words, they had everything to gain by coming to this new land and nothing to lose, because the place they came from was a whole lot worse. This was the land of opportunity in Eden and so on. The only cultural group, the only racial group that I know in the United States that does not follow in that pattern are the American Indians. While everybody else came to these shores and had everything to gain, Indians had everything to lose, and almost did lose everything by the 1900s, as you probably know if you read the history books. They almost lost everything. They were almost erased, literally, down from millions and millions, something like 14.5 million before pre-Columbian times, down to like 200,000 in the year 1900. But they were here long before anybody else. I happen to live just east, about 50 miles of Mesa Verde. If you are from ancestors from Israel, you know that Mesa Verde was built about the same time as Masada, the stronghold on the top of the mountain. And those wonderful people that lived there and were gone about 500 years before Columbus even fell off the boat, they'd already migrated downstream. They were gone. They had towns as large as any town in Europe. And they had doctors and astronomers and teachers and all the sophisticated things that they had in Europe too. I'm only glad maybe that the Mayan calendar was misinterpreted so that we can still be here today. But they had all those wonderful things, but they didn't have a way of recording them or writing about them, and so when they left and the new immigrants took over, they tended, as I mentioned earlier, to be defined by somebody else's definition, somebody else's way of defining it. But if you ever have a chance to visit some of those old ancient places, whether it's Cahokia near the present city of St. Louis or Mesa Verde out where I live, you know that those people, they had no disease, they had no prostitution, AIDS, drugs, all the societal problems that we have in a modern America, they didn't have any of that. Surely, if we could learn from those people, we'd be better off as a nation. There's no question in my mind. We just have to somehow bridge that gap and understand there is a way to do that. But it won't come easy and it won't come fast. But certainly forums like this help tell our story, and we hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Carolyn, I wonder if you have any online questions for us. We have precious little time, but
We're going to double-check the online, but a member of the audience would like to ask a question first, if that's all
Sure
right.
thing.
Hello, everyone. I've really enjoyed your presentations. I've learned so much. My remark is to Ben Campbell.
I'm sorry, we can't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for your remarks so far. I've learned so very much. My question and a remark first is to Ben Campbell. You know, I'm wondering why it's not recognized amongst the white population that this is racial profiling. You know, the lies and the hidden agendas and such. So I'm wondering if you could expound on that. And before you do, I just wanted to thank you for recognizing the interpreters and the use of sign language.
Thank you. I didn't hear you very well. Dealing with racial profiling?
Right, the idea just that these symbols, these images, the names that are used, why is it not considered racial profiling, and why don't the white majority recognize it as such?
Well, we consider it racial profiling, and maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe part of it's incumbent on us to try to tell our story a little better and a little more forcefully. But I think those people, more and more people are recognizing it. I mean, when I mentioned that sometimes I would talk to African American people or Hispanic Americans who are big supporters of the Redskins, and I'd ask them if they would mind if we used, you know, a derogatory name that they understood for the team here in Washington. They recognize that very well as sort of racial insults, and it is a form of racial profiling.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. This would be directed at Mr. Hester.
We can't understand you.
Mr. Hester, you said that you believe that most people, in their goodness, if you could reason with them, if they lived close to Native people, that they would understand how harmful these mascots are. However, I, like Mr. Duthu, am Homa Native American. My mother was born in a small indigenous village in Dulac, Louisiana, and taken as a 4-year-old child. And the Methodist missionaries that raised her, I've come to know them almost like grandparents. In a recent visit, I had noticed and was appalled by the fact that the Homa police force uses a logo emblem that is very similar to the Redskins mascot, you know, profile, head, completely bright red for whatever reason, and a Siouan headdress that has absolutely nothing to do with our tribe. And I was appalled by this, and I brought it up at dinner, and I was so confused as to why they had it. Brought up that local tribal elders didn't agree with it. I had just spoken to them that day. Corinne and Louise were not at all supportive. And these women that had raised my mother, given her food, shelter, seen the struggle of the Homa people, and had seen what it had done to my mother, looked at me in disgust and told me that I had no right to be offended by this, and that most people probably didn't even recognize or know that they were using that emblem, even though it is printed very largely on every police car patrolling the area, and none of those policemen are Homa. So I guess my question would be that situation exists. I mean, I'm living in it. So you have the goodness of these missionary women who have dedicated their lives to helping Homa children, but at the same time, they're looking at me, my baby sister, my mother, generations of Homa women, and they are telling us that we have no right to have any feeling about the racial oppression and the legacy of that in our own family.
Bruce, you want to take it?
Yes.
Yeah, well, she actually addressed it to me, and I think that you're pointing to that as an instance in which it's hard to see the good nature that might exist beneath that surface. And I have to say, that's exactly right. So many times there are people out there who are so driven by different views, different beliefs, You know, for example, one of the big problems that we have in Oklahoma is that it is a state in which the settlers, our big celebration day is 89er Day, okay? And 89er Day is the day in which the settlers came to take the land, okay? There isn't any way that an Indian person is going to feel good about that. On the other hand, it's part of the heritage of the settlers. So unfortunately, you really do have a complete disconnect. You have one group of people whose history, in many cases, that they would like to be able to celebrate, has in it so many bad things that they essentially ignore to be able to feel good about the other things, that there's really a kind of false consciousness there, and that can be horribly, deeply ingrained. So I'm not saying that it isn't hard, but I do believe that they're motivated by what they think are good things. And I think that there are good things in every group of people, and I want to hang on to that. So yes, I do think that there's something there, but yes, I agree with you. It's very, very hard sometimes to see where it might be, where that spark of decency, that spark of goodness is. And you just have to keep on working at it. Just keep on trying. It's going to be a tough row, but I think you're a strong person, and I think hopefully through continuing to engage them at some point or another, maybe that you can break through.
Can I just, Suzanne, thank you very much for your question. I grew up in Dulac. That's the village I grew up in. I will slightly disagree with Lee when he said that he believes mostly in the goodness of people. There's a big part of me that would like to be that generous, but I also believe there are very evil people in our society. Most people in Houma, there's a distinction between my tribe, the Houma people, and the city of Houma. And I bet you if you did one of those Jay Leno pass the microphone, the jaywalking episode, and said, why is this community known as Houma? Probably 9 out of 10 people in Houma would not know that there's a Houma tribe all around them that numbers over 15,000 people. And that this image that they've emblazoned on the police car, which is the city of Houma, not the tribe, so it's not our tribal government, would have no idea of what they're talking about there. Thank you. You mentioned missionary, and let me just say one thing. The missionaries, I grew up Roman Catholic, but the missionaries in our area, in Dulac, were basically in competition for parishioners, not to convert to Christianity, but to support their parishes, while they were also reminding them that they couldn't fully partake in the benefits of Christianity. My mom went to one of the Catholic mission schools where she was repeatedly told, God really appreciates that you're trying to make the effort to earn your place in heaven. You never will because you're a dirty Indian, but he appreciates and loves you for trying. That's what your folks were dealing with.
Suzanne?
In closing this out, I want to thank heartily Elizabeth Kennedy Gish and Eileen Maxwell and Leonda Levchuk, and of course our illustrious museum director Kevin Gover for putting on this marvelous symposium, and to the wonderful Carol Rapkivian, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Come back at 3:45 promptly.
Well, it's been very nice meeting you.